What's going on, guys? My name is Devin, and today I'm going to talk about my recent switch from Linux to Windows 10. Now, you're probably more used to hearing about people on YouTube talk about their switch from Windows to Linux, but I've actually been a long-time Linux user, so I kind of went the other direction recently. It's been a while since I actually used Windows, so I decided to give it a try, and to be honest, it impressed me a little bit more than I'd be willing to admit. Except I'm going to do so right now. So without further ado, I'm going to go into my switch from Linux to Windows. Before I get too far into it, I do want to talk about my history with Linux just a bit. So I've been a Linux user for about 7 years now, and I've been kind of experimenting with it for about 10, so 3 years prior to that. But about 7 years ago, I really got into using Linux full time. I pretty much completely switched over. I almost always had a Windows partition laying around somewhere just in case, but I was predominantly Linux for everything. My Windows installations would honestly get really out of date and would be really behind on updates, and it was even more annoying to use at that point because every time I booted it up, I was getting all kinds of alerts to update everything. So Linux has been what I primarily used. I've been really happy with it, to be honest. A lot of what I do on a daily basis is development oriented. I also do a lot of streaming, whether it's Netflix, Google Music, stuff like that. I pretty much consume a lot of content, and I develop. That's mostly what I use my computer for. So unlike a lot of people, even though my computer is perfectly capable, I don't really do a whole lot of gaming on it, so that's never really been a concern for me. So Linux really has been a really good option for me. The Bash terminal is great. It's obviously what makes Mac OS so good for developers. It's kind of based on Unix or Linux technology. And even I use a Mac OS laptop at work. I have a MacBook Pro, and that's been a pretty good experience too because the parallels are pretty similar, right? Between Mac OS and Linux, a lot of software works right out of the box on both platforms. I can use a lot of the same utilities. There's often similar kinds of support for both platforms. So that's really nice. I really enjoyed my time on Linux. However, it's not perfect, right? Even though there are fairly large companies behind a lot of these Linux distributions, there's not as much money, typically, or ever, really. If we compare things like NVIDIA and Microsoft to Red Hat and Ubuntu, there's obviously a lot more money involved with Microsoft and NVIDIA, and there's a lot more interest in those companies getting things like drivers to work absolutely flawlessly, as compared to Linux distributions, right? There's a variety of reasons for that, and there are a lot of things that are in the works right now that are probably going to make that a lot better in the future. But as of right now, there's obviously more interest, and just more benefit for these larger companies to focus on Windows. When it comes to PCs, your only options for anything practical as far as the stuff I do goes is Windows or Linux distribution. While there's many Linux distributions out there, they share a lot of the same technologies. And a lot of the problems that you're going to experience on one Linux distribution will occur on a different one. It's not everything, but for the most part, that's the case. I've used a lot of different Linux distributions in my time, starting from Ubuntu, going to Manjaro Linux, kind of dabbling in Arch Linux. For a long time I went full Arch. I've played with Antergos. I played with Fedora for a long period of time, and even some boutique distributions in between, like Elementary OS and a bunch of different stuff. Most of my time has been spent on either Ubuntu or Arch. But I've had plenty of experience with a bunch of different distributions out there. Not everything, totally understand that, but I think enough to at least have a good gauge of the Linux ecosystem and stuff that's going to support my own hardware. I've even gone the Hackintosh route which has surprised me in many ways. And, certain things like graphical performance with a Hackintosh on my computer, which should never be able to run Mac OS, is just miles ahead of what Linux can do. Any distribution with any desktop environment, proprietary drivers or free drivers, it just absolutely blows my mind what a Hackintosh can do. But there are so many other problems with a Hackintosh, and it's going to vary greatly on your system and your configuration, but I have some problems that are just absolute deal breakers that maybe I'll get into in a different video. So I've dealt with a lot of the small Linux annoyances for a long time, and I would very strongly compare those to a lot of the Windows annoyances that I've had in the past. And I'm very upfront about being transparent that I don't think any operating system is the best. I don't think any of them are really that much better than others. I have a preference and I have reasons for that, but I don't love any operating system, whether it's a desktop operating system or a mobile operating system. I have problems with all of them, and I contemplate switching between all of them frequently. Windows has just been lower on this list by a good margin in the past. However, after revisiting kind of Hackintoshing stuff, after playing around with some Linux stuff and having some problems that weren't necessarily deal breakers but were more annoyances, I decided, why not give Windows a chance? I haven't used Windows 10 in a long time. I barely messed with it. Last time I really used Windows was Windows 7, and this was quite a while ago, and I wasn't even nearly as into development as I am now. I was a little bit, I was doing some stuff, but it was completely different. And so now, the development landscape has changed, what I'm working on has changed, Windows has changed, the tools available on Windows have changed. I figured, why not give it another chance? And I'm definitely glad I did. I won't reveal yet if it's something that I've stuck with full time, but I'm very impressed. So, as soon as I started using Windows 10 again, one of the first things I realized was that it was much faster than I remember. From startup to shutdown, things seem to work a lot quicker. I used Windows 8 quite a bit a few years ago, and I really was not a huge fan of that, so it's nice to see the different visual improvements that they've made to make it more desktop friendly and less touch heavy. And I know that with some of their products like the Surface and the Surface Book, that they utilize more of those different modes a little bit better. So I think that's pretty cool. I think they've found a pretty good balance. And overall, I think the desktop environment is actually pretty good. A lot of the shortcuts are nice. A lot of the features for the desktop are nice. It's not too much. It's not too little. I actually really enjoy the desktop. And the window management is really great, which is probably a good thing considering the operating system's name is Windows. So good on them for, I guess, staying ahead of the trend. But, it really feels like the frame rate is high. There's no issues. There's no screen tearing. There's no lag. Everything I do feels very responsive on the desktop. Now, one thing that I noticed that was a little bit disappointing was that I did have some updates when I got back into my Windows partition. As I'd mentioned, I almost always have a Windows partition laying around, so I actually had a really old Windows 10 install, and it may have been even over a year old, but the updates on that took about 2.5 hours, and most of that was state of preparing to install. And I don't know much about the Windows installer. I don't know if I could have got more of a verbose output somewhere, but it was just stuck at preparing to install for about 2.5 hours. About 15 minutes into this, initially, I hit the cancel button, and it canceled pretty quickly, so thankfully it didn't get stuck there in some kind of like in-between state. But I rebooted Windows, came back in, went to the update, and it got stuck at preparing to install. So, after about 15 more minutes of that, I realized this is just going to take a while, and I'm just going to wait. eventually finished. I mean, credit to Windows, even though it was slow and just absolutely excruciating to just sit there and wait for my computer to do something for 2.5 hours, it worked. The update eventually finished, it installed, it rebooted, and I booted into the Windows 10 Fall Creator Update, whatever that means. So from then on, things were okay. I made sure all my drivers were up to date. I, got all the software I needed. I found basically a third-party package manager similar to Homebrew called Chocolatey that I hadn't really looked too much into before, and I installed most of my software, through Chocolatey, both command line and GUI. So even Google Chrome, Slack, a bunch of stuff I installed with Chocolatey. So that was kind of cool. But that even had some of its own problems. I had a few package upgrades along the way that just kind of failed, and I don't know, it left them in an incomplete state. Then I had to force uninstall them and force reinstall them, and that was a little frustrating. One of those was Git, which is really disappointing considering Git should be a very popular package and should be extremely well tested. I don't know. So that was a little disappointing, even though I don't prefer Brew over a native package manager like you would find in Linux. Chocolatey seemed a bit less, polished and functional than Brew, so that's a little disappointing. Better than nothing, but disappointing. So I continued to kind of set up my Windows machine. I got a lot of my software downloaded, I got my source code downloaded, and I started developing. And overall, it's not been a terrible experience. Probably the most annoying thing, I guess, is some of the package management stuff, like I just mentioned a minute ago. And also that whenever I edit some source code, even in IDEs like IntelliJ, it tries to correct the white space and use Windows white spacing, and then Git is like, no, we're not going to do that, and fixes it for you. But even if you don't modify any files, you can have changes show up in your Git diff, but it's all white space changes that Git just undoes anyway. So that's really kind of annoying. The terminal obviously isn't nearly as good. I even installed Commander, CMDER, which is a third-party terminal that uses PowerShell and can kind of emulate some bash commands, which is better, but it's not nearly as nice. It doesn't have everything, and obviously I don't have access to Linux repositories at all through that. So it really just feels like a, imposter compared to what I'm used to. So I don't know. I'm sure some people really like it. I'm sure it can be useful for a lot of Windows users, but compared to what I'm used to, it felt really, I don't know, it really held back, really restricted. I even noticed that running just scripts that involved administrative privileges weren't easy out of the box with Windows. On my Linux boxes, I really prefer to have a script that I've written up that installs everything I need, reinstalls all my packages, downloads all my source code, and I can just run that whenever I install a new OS. But with Windows, it didn't really work out so well. I would have to run some command just to be able to run scripts, and then I ran into some other issues with that, and I don't obviously know PowerShell as well as Bash, so I had some other problems, and it just by no means seemed worth it or any better than what I had been used to. So that was definitely a bit disappointing, but I guess not as much of a surprise as some of the other things that I experienced with Windows. Everyday work, streaming stuff obviously was great. Windows is a first-class citizen with any streaming service. Linux is always going to be secondary to that. So I didn't expect any issues there. All the software I wanted to run was available. I didn't have any issues in that department. Updates are slow compared to what I'm used to, but weren't excruciating. But yeah, there was a lot of small quality of life things that really just bothered me and ultimately became a deal breaker. The terminal just wasn't cutting it for me. A lot of small issues that I had that cropped up that were Windows specific just really kind of ate away at me. Things like, just being used to Node version manager, really enjoying that, and there's being kind of like a knockoff version on Windows. It's not the same developers, it's not the same product, and it just is, everything feels a little bit inferior for development as compared to what I'm used to on Mac OS and Linux, which are very similar these days. Honestly, if I had the choice of running a fully supported version of Mac OS on a PC, I might actually do that these days. Even though there are a lot of things I have issues with on Mac OS, it's a stable desktop, it runs really well on my MacBook, and that's what I'm looking for these days in an operating system. Not all is lost, though. There's definitely a little bit of hope out there. I recently gave a new version of Linux a try. It started with KDE Neon, and I kind of switched it up and went to Kubuntu 17.10, so that's the KDE flavor of Ubuntu, the official flavor, so all the supported packages and everything like that, and it's got official support from Ubuntu. And I'm actually really enjoying it. It's solved a lot of my issues that I've kind of had with Linux in the past. GNOME has some pretty big issues that I think will get worked out and will get worked on and will get fixed now that it's got Ubuntu's full support behind it as far as the desktop goes, and it's Red Hat and Fedora's kind of main operating system these days. So I'm sure a lot of these issues are going to get figured out, and maybe I'll return to GNOME, but KDE is actually looking pretty nice right now. I'm really enjoying myself. So I used Windows for, several weeks. I tried a lot of things. I had some ups and downs, not nearly as many downs as I thought I would. I really actually enjoyed using the operating system in a lot of ways. And for the average person, I can totally see Windows being a very viable platform right now. More so, I think, than in the past. Personally, I think that Windows 10 is actually better than Windows 7, which was a pretty good release. So Windows did much better than I expected, but for me personally, there were a number of shortcomings that I just couldn't deal with. My workflow, using the terminal, the applications, a variety of things just fit much better with Linux right now. And while it's not perfect, every operating system has its issues, including Windows, and right now Linux's issues are more bearable for me than Windows. I will be keeping the Windows partition, and I plan to boot into it every now and then. I plan to upgrade things, play with things, see what's new. I definitely have a reinvigorated view of Windows, and I'm excited to see where they go from here, and I really hope that they become a better development platform. But in the meantime, I'll be hanging around on Linux. I'm enjoying KDE. If you haven't tried KDE out and you're a Linux user, I definitely recommend giving it a try. These days, the KDE Plasma desktop, I believe we just hit 5.12, which is an LTS. It's pretty nice. It's really stable. The frame rate's high. There's a lot of settings to go through, but if you dial in the ones that you like, it's a really good experience. So I'll be on Linux, running Kubuntu, using KDE Plasma for the time being. I'll be checking in back on Windows in the days, months, years to come. I definitely enjoy checking out all sides of technology. I'm a fan of keeping up to date on all the operating systems and seeing what everyone has to offer. But yeah, if you've stuck with me throughout this whole video, thank you for watching. If you've liked this video, if you want to know more, if you have some opinions on anything I've talked about, let me know. Feel free to give me a like, give me a comment down below, subscribe to my channel if you want to see more of me. This is the second video in kind of a 12 video challenge proposed by my co-host on my podcast, mod chat, sorry. So back in December, my co-host challenged me to upload at least one video to YouTube a month, and so here I am. This is my second video, and also I'm uploading my videos on DTube. So if you're a fan of that website, then definitely go check them out. If you haven't ever heard of DTube, I would still recommend you check it out. It's kind of a more peer-to-peer, cryptocurrency-driven YouTube alternative. So it's really interesting to me. I definitely recommend checking it out. It's not super huge yet, but I think it'd be awesome to get in early. But yeah, like, comment, subscribe. Let me know what you thought. Feel free to follow me here on YouTube, subscribe. You can also find me on Twitter, Steemit, pretty much everywhere on the internet as ParanoidCoder. Feel free to subscribe to me, follow me, and yeah, let me know what you think. Let me know if you've switched to Windows 10 recently. Let me know if you switched to Linux recently and what your thoughts are. Anyways, I will see you guys in the next video here in the next month. Take it easy.